for a very long time, when it comes to prevention, right, and taking a public health approach, so here we're talking about what are actually risk factors and protective factors which impact vulnerability towards violence. There's been a lot of space work which has been done, but the question in which part of it. So the public health approach has got three main things. There's a primary prevention, which is raising barriers to entry, so people don't go towards or are not vulnerable towards violence in the first place. Secondary prevention, which is around if someone is already in that space, how do you get them, off-ramp them? And then tertiary prevention is once someone has already committed violence, how do you get them out, preventing recidivism? Now, in the larger scheme of things, and this is over decades, there's a lot more programming which has been, or programming and resources which have been dedicated towards secondary and tertiary, and a lot less on primary prevention. And when you actually start talking to local governments or stakeholders in terms of why isn't there so much dedicated effort on primary prevention, the response is always, there's so many things we can possibly do. How do we know which one? Right? Because again, there's so many things you can do, because the reason why a person might be vulnerable to violence is not one. It's a culmination of all these aspects of their life. So we haven't had the tools or the ability to do primary prevention well or do it in a dedicated way. So when we talk about using explainable machine learning, that's what we're doing. We're bringing data and big data and data analytics to actually understand how do we prioritize which risk factors should be mitigated and which protective factors have to be enhanced. So this is about having more efficiency in the allocation of resources, so you get the most bang for the buck.
What I find fascinating is most of the discussion at the summit as regards technology constantly deals with the social media platform.
Yes.
You're looking here, you're using the newest of technologies for solutions.
Of course. Well, yes, that's why we're here. It has to be around solutions. So yes, there's a lot of talk of what happens in the online space. And again, once people are already in that space, you're already talking about secondary prevention, right? They've already started to intersect with the content, and now you're trying to figure out how do you get them off the online space. So we talk a lot about what's happening in the online space and then online to offline. What we're talking about is how do we prevent the offline to online transition in the first place? And this is not about people not using social media, but if they're using social media, why are they seeking out the harm or the hateful content, right? And that's the difference, right? So how do you reduce vulnerability in the first place?
So you seem to, what I'm hearing you say is that transition from offline to online is a critical point.
Absolutely, right? Because when, why are people going there? What are they looking for that they're not getting in their regular lives? And you'll hear people talk about, well, there's needs, there's narratives, there's the network, right? They want to feel this sense of purpose and belonging. Who am I? Figuring out their identities. And the fact that they are unable to get that from the world that they physically live in, right? And then they're seeking out alternatives online. That is about where our own society has to do better, right? Because the idea that we can only find someone who cares about us is someone in this anonymous online world, and we can't find people who create that sense of belonging for us in the physical world we live in, is our failing. And that's for us is where the resilience has to be built, right? We have to reduce those points of vulnerability, and we actually need to have a healthier society.
So in other words, what's drawing them to online, and can we in some way pivot them toward this, which is a more viable solution?
So it's not even pivot. The idea is that they should actually not, if we can we do enough that they don't select that path in the first place, right? Raising the barriers to entry so that they don't seek that path in the first place. Look, when you and I go online, right, we don't look up hate content. We're not looking up manifestos, and we're not looking to figure out ways to hurt others, right? Or if we come across racist content or threats, we don't just say, oh, that's okay, right? We actually have we have a negative response to that content, right? And that's what we need everyone to have, right? Not seek it out, because the person who encounters this content and thinks it's okay or is looking for more of it, that means there's already something else happening that has happened, or the trajectory in their life has already made them vulnerable.
When you, here at the summit, when you talk about these, what I will call innovative methodologies, what comes back at you?
Surprise. Let's put it. So the work we're doing, it's not sexy at all, right? We're talking about this very practical application of technology. And so the actual local governments and governments who are responsible in it are like, wow, we never knew you could actually do this in a meaningful way. And then others are just like, oh, we never thought of it. Or actually, they're surprised because, again, this approach is new, right? We've done this in the US, and now we have actually expanding it out to Canada. So it hasn't been done before. We also recognize that to actually implement this, the impact in the long term is actually more resilient societies. And that resilience at that community level is not just against one form of violence. It's against many different forms of violence.
That's interesting. So the efficacy is multidimensional.
Yes.
It's not singular.
Yes. However, and the other part of that is that to actually start to implement on it, right? So you can do the analytics, you engage with the stakeholders, you can develop or co-develop recommendations, right? What's actually how they have to implement. Depending on the location, one of the biggest challenges they have is actually bringing the stakeholders together and recognizing that trying to eradicate hate or domestic terrorism or gun violence, it's not just about law enforcement, right? It's also not just about the health sector. It's not just mental health. You actually have to look at the other dimensions of social cohesion and education and quality of education and access. So there's a lot of other dimensions.
That breaking down of those stovepipes is critical.
Yes. And that's also politically fraught depending on the environment or the location you're in.